And hello to everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to the forum. I'm Connie Nestor, and I have had the extreme pleasure of chairing this Scottish American History Forum for about the last dozen years. Want to wish you all a heartfelt welcome. And as most of you know, the History Forum is part of the Arts and Cultural Division of Chicago Scots, formerly the Illinois St. Andrew Society, which founded, as you know, the oldest 501c3 charity in the state of Illinois in 1845. We're very proud of that. Caledonia Senior Living and Memory Care, which is located in North Riverside, Illinois. And Chicago Scots, by the way, is dedicated to nurturing Scottish identity through service, fellowship, and celebration of our Scottish culture, in addition to support for Caledonia Senior Living and Memory Care. For more information, please check our website, www.chicagoscots.org. And we always ask you to please give generously to our charity. We're so proud of it. It's something all Scots can be proud of. And before we begin our presentation today, I see that our president and noble leader, Gus Noble, no pun intended, has joined us. Gus has been president for many, many years of Chicago Scots and the former Illinois St. Andrew Society. And Gus is here to welcome us all and to bring us up to date, Gus, on what's happening.
Thank you, Connie. I hope everyone's well. It's really good to see everyone. And Matthew, I'm really looking forward to hearing your presentation today. I bring greetings from Caledonia Senior Living. Everyone is very well and enjoying some spectacular weather that we've had over the last week or so. The fall and autumn colors are really showing themselves beautifully in our little part of Illinois, surrounded by forest preserve as we are. Couple of announcements. Of course, we're heading fast towards St. Andrew's Day, 30th of November, which is the day we will celebrate our Feast of the Haggis, our St. Andrew's Day Gala. It's the 179th annual. We are the oldest charity in Illinois, therefore this was the event that started the organization, and therefore it's the oldest black tie dinner in the city of Chicago. We're going to be presenting a couple of awards. One, the highest honor we can pay is our Distinguished Citizen Award, and that goes this year to Professor Sir Neil Ferguson, who is going to be traveling from Scotland to Chicago, and just especially for the event. And then also to Paul and Kathy Melville. Paul was the chair of our board, and his first meeting was in January 2020. So he really stepped into the shoes of the chair of a board that oversees a senior living community right at the beginning of COVID-19 pandemic. And it was through Paul's leadership and the leadership of the board that Paul led so well that we got through the pandemic with zero fatalities. We didn't lose a single resident to COVID-19, which is really remarkable. We have launched, as many of you know, a partnership with the National Trust for Scotland Foundation USA, whereas every card-carrying member of the Chicago Scots automatically gets reciprocal membership of the National Trust for Scotland. And we encourage everyone to come and join us. And to that end, we're going to be releasing a series of videos between now and St. Andrew's Day, the top 10 reasons to join the Chicago Scots. So I hope you'll look out for those. There'll be one dropping, it's the third in the top 10, will be dropping next week. So I commend those to you. And I think in the interest of time, because we did get a slightly later start, I'll button it now and say that I'm really looking forward to your marks, Matthew.
Thank you, Gus. Thanks for those words of inspiration. And I promise to become a lifetime member this week. It's been on my list for a long time and I'm embarrassed. So it'll happen, I promise, this week.
Okay. Thank you, Connie. And I should say you don't need to live in Chicago to become a Chicago Scots member. It's for everyone who's Scottish by birth, by heritage, or simply by inclination, no matter where in the world you are.
Absolutely, absolutely. We've got the only senior living and memory care campus in the whole world. provided by Scots and supported by Scots. So it's very unique. And we do need your support. We'll talk about that maybe next month, Gus. Maybe you can go into that, please.
Sure.
Okay, good. Well, I just have one quick announcement before we begin. This keeps me busy admitting people. I just want to remind everyone that on December 14th, next month, Dr. Derek Patrick, who is a lecturer at the School of History, University of St. Andrews, Scotland, will be with us, and he's going to talk about the Black Watch. So it should be very interesting, and we'll count on you all being here. So now it's time to turn the presentation over to our very esteemed professor, Dr. Matthew Dziennik, and he's here from Annapolis, Maryland. He is Associate Professor, British and British Imperial History at the United States Naval Academy, and he's just gone gangbusters in the last couple of years. And Matthew, we're delighted to have you back by popular return. Matthew was here a year ago, a little over a year ago, spoke to us in September on the Highlands and the Islands after 1746. And today, Matthew is going to talk to us about Scotland and the First World War. Matthew, we're going to turn the show over to you now, please.
Yeah, thank you so much, Connie and Gus, for inviting me. It's such a real pleasure to be back. It was great fun last year, and I'm so glad to see everybody here. I really appreciate.
Oh no.
Yeah, for some reason it just automatically muted me. This is AI at work. This is, the computer knows who to listen to and who not to. The no, I want to start with a wee a caveat, somewhat, and that is to say, this Scotland and the First World War is not my major area of expertise, but I have been teaching this for a while. At the Naval Academy, there's a huge recognition, of course, that we are returning potentially to an age of great power conflict. As opposed to a kind of one polar world, if you will. And so our emphasis has moved slightly towards trying to understand great power conflict in the past, and therefore the First World War is a major part of that. And so I've become very, very interested in the role of Scotland in the First World War. And what I want to do today is kind of to give you a flavor of some of the things that go on. And what I tried to do, what I thought I would do, is obviously I'm going to talk about what Scots do in the war, but my major effort is to kind of think more broadly about what the war means to Scotland and Scots, and because that's often the consequence of conflict. It's not so much, obviously, for the people involved. What happens on the battlefield is deeply important, but it's often the consequences of conflict that really shape our world and the world around us. And so that's what I'm going to try and do. So let me see if I can share this and give you a wee kind of insight. Can I just confirm, Connie, that you can see that and all that looks good?
Looks fantastic. Thank you.
Okay, great, fantastic. And I think the other thing I'll maybe do is please type questions into the chat. I'll maybe come back to them at the end. But if you've got a question in your head, stick it in the chat or hold it and we'll come back to it at the end. I'll definitely leave time for plenty of questions. At the dedication of the Scottish National War Memorial in Edinburgh Castle in 1927, the designer of the memorial, a man named Sir Lawrence Weaver, stood up and he said, "Scotland laments the glorious, England mourns the dead." The noble Scottish National War Memorial typifies this characteristic of the race. as the silence on Armistice Day is symbolic of the English temperament. When the Englishman bows his head on Armistice Day, the Scots lift up his voice. England has made an ethereal monument of her backwardness. An interesting phrase, given that Weaver was himself born in England. But Scotland has mobilised all the resources of her national art into a visible monument. Now, for those of you who have maybe been to Edinburgh Castle and seen the National War Memorial, it is probably one of the most sacred places in Scotland. It's a deeply impressive structure at the top of Edinburgh Castle. But what Sir Lawrence, I think, is trying to say here is a couple of things. I think he's first and foremost saying Scotland is different. Scotland had experienced this war different to England, maybe different to the other combatants. I think the other thing, and this is much more implicit, but this is kind of one of the senses I get from what he's trying to say, is that despite all the carnage and the blood and the industrial scale of war that had been witnessed during the First World War, somehow Scotland had not really been changed. There's a kind of element here of that romantic 19th century view of war, of the nation in arms, of the idea of somehow almost being created and saved, in a sense, by war. So while England had become this place which mourned the dead, Scotland remained dedicated to this kind of more glorious view of war. And I wanted to start with this because there are parts of this that I think Weaver got right. Scotland did experience the war differently than England, and I will get on to some of that today. But I think he got an awful lot wrong as well. Because when he says that, in a sense, Scotland had not been changed, or that Scotland had somehow wished to continue to celebrate this glorious interpretation of war that had maybe been suitable to, the age of 19th century British expansion, it's not really what happens in Scotland after the First World War. And so I use this as kind of framing today, because what I want to do is maybe talk about the ways in which Scotland was different, experienced the war differently, but also in the ways in which Scotland was deeply changed, deeply traumatized by the experience of the First World War. And that's really what I want to do, kind of explore these things. And honestly, I've not entirely made up my own mind about exactly what the major repercussions of the First World War on Scotland are. But this, in a sense, this is kind of an exploration that we can go along together, because I'm really curious to see what you think. I'm going to try and lay out some evidence, and I'm really curious to see what your thoughts on what the war meant for Scotland. So what I'm going to do is I go through. Just for some reason, it does not want to jump forward, which is a bit weird. So let me, not entirely, oh, here we go, figured it out. Look at that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about Scotland just prior to the war. I'm going to talk about Scotland's contributions, and then I'm going to talk about some of the consequences, things like the anti-war movement, the economic repercussions, and the political repercussions. And as I say, like, we'll come at the end and we'll kind of maybe have a wee discussion about what this means. So I think one of the most important things to begin with, to acknowledge and understand what the Great War means to Scotland, is first of all to acknowledge just how dedicated Scotland is to the British Union in the years leading up to the First World War. There is, of course, a well-established argument that Scotland enters the Union with England predominantly for access to English markets, predominantly for access to English expansion and colonial endeavors abroad, the horrors of the Darien expedition in Panama, where Scotland had tried to establish its own empire, and the failure of that in the 1690s, combined with a widespread famine and dearth in the 1690s in Scotland, had basically convinced Scotland's elite that if they wanted to operate on the international stage, if they wanted their country to be taken seriously, they would have to join with England to make that the case. And of course, there's a tremendous amount of resistance to that. There are, of course, riots in the streets amongst the common people of Scotland when this happens. But over time, and of course, obviously the Jacobite rebellions that come in afterwards, but over time, and it's not universal, but over time, there's this broad acceptance that union with England is beneficial to Scotland. And this probably reaches its height in the late 19th, early 20th century. And it takes two forms. There's a kind of industrial economic side and there's a cultural side. By the late 19th century, Scotland is producing somewhere in the region, arguably, of about 50% of all British shipping. So Scotland is really leading the way in terms of Britain's global maritime power. Scotland is also producing a substantial proportion of its steel and its coal. Scottish consumers are benefiting from access to colonial goods coming from the British Empire. Scottish towns and cities are benefiting from kind of unique micro industries that are developing, the most famous of which is, of course, Dundee's jute trade. Dundee famous for the three J's: jute, jam, and journalism. The jute trade between India and Dundee is employing about 50,000 people in Dundee by the late 19th century. So while there are obviously uneven effects, there is this broad acceptance that Scotland is doing well out of the Union. Then there's this cultural commitment. There is a deep Scottish commitment to British imperialism. The image that I previously just showed of the Scottish National Exhibition in 1908 is really a kind of classic example of this. It was designed to illustrate kind of Scotland's contributions to the Union, but it is very, and this is a huge exhibition that's held in Edinburgh in 1908, but it is hugely dedicated to kind of sharing the idea that Scotland is part of the British Empire and Scotland shares imperial values, all the way down to some pretty reprehensible stuff. So there is actually a human zoo at the 1908 exhibition in which several families from Nigeria were displayed, almost like a kind of an exhibition in and of itself. In Edinburgh in 1908. So there is this, obviously, this Scottish commitment to the British Empire. Then, of course, there's the disproportionate military commitments. That is a crucial part of Scotland's thinking on empire. There is mass migration from Scotland to British colonies. I mean, that's, to a certain extent, why Chicago Scots exists. The Scots are a disproportionate number of immigrants from the British Isles and Ireland to the United States, Canada, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand in the 19th century. One thing to consider, though, before we move on. So broadly, Scotland is well into this union. The benefits and the drawbacks are uneven. And arguably by 1914, you're starting to see a decline. The economic advantages are not as brilliant as they were in the early to mid 19th century. While shipbuilding is obviously doing extremely well, Scotland's kind of trade with the empire is obviously still going up, but declining in per capita terms. There are also far less Scots signing up to the military by the early 20th century than had been the case in the past. Scotland's kind of contribution to the British military as a kind of overall percentage really peaks with the Napoleonic Wars. And throughout the 19th century, this is in decline. And one of the reasons for this is so many of these Scots are coming from places like the Highlands. And of course, the Highlands are subject to mass clearance in the 19th century. So there's simply less people in some of these traditional recruiting places to draw from. All of this is to say Scotland is vested in the Union, but the benefits are either uneven or even starting to decline by 1914. So what was Scotland's contribution to the war when it began? And I think you got to begin with motives. You got to begin why. Why, you know, obviously Scotland is part of the British Empire. It commits to the war. Scottish MPs vote in favour of the war. But why did the average Scot end up signing up in huge numbers? I think, first of all, you've got to consider the economic part of this. So while large areas of Scotland are being cleared in the 19th century, this is increasingly an urban and demographically robust society. The number of Scots is increasing in the late 19th, early 20th century, and they're a more significant percentage of the overall UK population, which means there is manpower to draw on. The issue is that, as I say, it's an overwhelmingly urban environment. And what is starting to happen in Scottish cities in a big way is both overcrowding and poverty. So in 1914, about 50% of all Scots lived in a one-bedroom house. When you compare that with England in the same period, which was about 10%, you really quickly get an insight into how somewhat behind the curve is economically Scotland is by the early 20th century. And as I said, you know, there are immense benefits to the empire, but there are also very uneven benefits to the empire. And so I think at the very first, you have to accept that economic or poverty is a crucial part of what motivates Scots into service during the First World War. And a good example of this is maybe the comparison between the miners who enlist. So in the west of Scotland, around about 20% of all miners enlisted in the military during the war. In the east, it was more like 40%, double. And you ask, well, why is this? Why is there such, you know, this huge disparity between miners in the east and west? Well, the plain fact was that Scottish mines in the east supplied the North Sea environment. And the North Sea environment and contact with Europe is cut off. The mines in the west of Scotland had always supplied colonial environments. And those colonial networks are still largely in place. The Royal Navy is able to kind of maintain control of the waves. So in effect, there are more jobs in West Coast mines than there are in the East Coast. And as a result, you see this huge disparity of enlistment. So what I'm saying is, like, straight off the bat, you have to accept that there's an economic part to the contribution of Scots to the British military in the First World War. There are also things like major issues in that classic area or arena of British recruitment in Scotland, which are, of course, the Highlands and Islands. The case of the Highlands and Islands, the suffering experienced by the peasantry in Gaelic Scotland and in the crofting communities of Gaelic Scotland in the 19th century is pretty unspeakable. I mean, these are a people who have experienced repeated famines. You know, obviously the last great one in the 1840s. But also, you know, significant dearth and hunger for, you know, incrementally across the 19th century. So much so that in 1886, the government had stepped in with something called the Crofters Act, which was designed to protect the peasantry in the Highlands and Islands from unnecessary eviction. The problem with that is that while it protected land tenure in parts of the Highlands, it didn't actually resolve the fundamental problem, which was the vast majority of land was owned by landowners with, only tiny scraps of pretty marginal land actually owned by people. And so you have this situation where there's a government recognition of problems in the Highlands, but not yet the impetus to do much about the fundamental problem. So you have a lot of Gaels in the Highlands and Islands who end up enlisting in the British military in the First World War for the very same reasons their grandfathers and great-grandfathers had enlisted in the British military in the 18th and early 19th century, which is land. There is this concept in the Gaeltacht in the Scottish Highlands and in older clan society that you held land, your tenure of the land was based on your military service. And this continues into the late 19th and even into the early 20th century. And so many families are being promised tenure on the land, long-term leases on their land, if they provide men to the army. And it's amazing to kind of see these things stretch across time, so my main area of expertise is British recruitment in the Highlands and Islands in the 18th century. And of course, land is a crucial part of this. The promise of land is a crucial part of this. And you fast forward, 150 years, and there it's still being displayed again in the First World War. So all of this is to say there is clearly an economic part of what's going on. But it's not just economic. As I said, first and foremost, Scotland is deeply committed to the British Empire. And there is a broad recognition that the rise of Germany poses a significant and existential threat to the British Empire. So many Scots are enlisting for exactly the same patriotic reasons that people are enlisting in England and indeed all over Europe in 1914. Scots are not immune to this by any stretch of the imagination. There are also a couple of kind of somewhat unique Scottish elements to this, which is Scots are deeply proud of their military contributions to the British Empire. The British Empire has really gone out of its way to emphasize the role of Scots in its public culture to do with the empire. So, the great pictographs or the great images of 19th century British imperialism, particularly in a military capacity, it's almost inevitable that there will be a kilted regiment there. Forgive me, sorry, this is my forgive me. Sorry. So there's almost an inevitability that there will be a kilted regiment in that image, and you can think to the great images, Gibbs, the Thin Red Line, the Sutherland Highlanders at Balaclava, or say the Gordon Highlanders in the Tarai campaign, or the kilted regiments during the Sudanese campaign against the Mahdi. So Scots feel in 1914 that they are part of a longer story of Scottish military contributions to the British Empire and defending the honour of the British Empire. There is also this other somewhat connected thing, but equally important, which is just this understanding of Scotland being a traditional repository of warriors. So since the medieval period, frankly, Scots had been some of the best mercenaries in all of Europe. And you find Scots fighting, for the Gaelic kings in Ireland in their battles against English colonialism. You find Scots fighting with the Swedish army in the 30 Years' War. You find Scots in the service of the French king. You find Scottish formations in the armies of Poland, Lithuania, the Commonwealth of Poland, Lithuania. And so there is this sense that this is part of Scotland's destiny. And if there is a war to be fought in Europe, it would make no sense that Scots were not part of it. So this is all the motivations that bring Scots to the First World War. What about what they actually do in that war? Well, probably the most famous Scottish contribution to the war is a unit called the 51st Highland Division. This is a territorial force. It's raised in 1908. So what does this mean? The territorial army and the territorial forces were basically kind of the National Guard. And they're established in the early 20th century as Britain realizes that it is probably going to have to go to war with at least one of the major powers of Europe in the next 20 to 30 years. And they realize, of course, that with national conscription operating in Germany and France and Russia, the regular British army simply will be unable to cope with a European war. So they raise these reserve battalions, and they're significant in number. They're not as well trained. They're not as effective as the National Guard formations of, say, France or Germany. But it is at least a major step forward for Britain, which had traditionally been highly opposed to kind of militarizing society. In the British tradition, you had a small regular army that kind of did the work for you, and where the majority of the emphasis went was on the Royal Navy, of course, to protect your shores and your trade routes. So it's a major step forward for the British in the early 20th century to begin establishing these National Guard battalions. So the territorial 51st Highland Division is raised in 1908. And in 1914, 1915, it's plundered to support the regular army. The British regular army, is only able to send 6 divisions to the Western Front in 1914. And when you consider the French are fielding somewhere in the region of about 140, 150 divisions in 1914, you get a sense of just how small scale Britain's contribution to the war initially is. The problem that these formations have is that because of Scotland's reputation for its martial effectiveness, they are among the first formations plundered from the territorial army and sent to support the regular army in France. The difficulty is, of course, that warfare is changing. Now, sure, esprit de corps, elan, confidence, aggression, these are still hugely significant factors in conflict. Famously, Napoleon said, morale is to the physical as 3 is to 1. And yet the nature of warfare is changing. The advent of heavy artillery, machine guns, trenches, gas, aircraft, observation, radio communication. These are turning war more into a question of numbers and planning rather than necessarily the elan of individual regiments. And so when these Scottish regiments from the territorial army are plucked and sent to join British regulars, they don't look very good because they're not. They don't have the same training as regular battalions. They don't have as much experience as regular battalions. Eventually, by 1915, the entire 51st Highland Division is eventually sent to the front as Britain's commitment to the Western Front increases. But you have the same problem. These are guys that are not trained. Sure, their reputation as Scots and as Highlanders precedes them, but they simply are not at that moment up to doing the type of fighting that is going to be necessary to hold the line on the Western Front. And so they get this very cruel nickname in the early part of the war, which is Harper's Duds. The first commander of the 51st Highland Division was Major General Harper, and they become known as Harper's Duds for their relatively poor performance in the opening part of the war. And you have quotations by people like Lord Haig, the overall British commander on the Western Front, effectively saying that the 51st Highland Division is not yet ready to go into the line because they simply do not know their craft. At the same time, you can't expect anything different. These are guys from Inverness, Perth, Aberfeldy. crofting communities in Ardnamurchan and Sutherland suddenly expected to deal with the horrors of modern warfare. What is deeply impressive is that the 51st Highland Division, despite that kind of early difficulty, becomes one of the elites of the British Army. They perform superbly when a lot of British formations have limited experience. They perform superbly during the Somme campaign. Now, one of the things that's often forgotten about the Somme, everybody kind of remembers the first day of the Somme, the 1st of July 1916, the bloodiest day in the history of the British Army. Some 20,000 troops are killed, some 40,000 are wounded on one day during the assault on the Somme. What's often forgotten is that over the course of the next 3 months, the Somme largely becomes a British victory. There is no breakthrough as expected, but the British Army successfully both detracts German attention from their assault on Verdun, which was the initial reason for the Somme offensive in the first place, and also significantly wears down some of the best German formations over the course of those 3 months of fighting on the Somme. And it's during this 3 months of fighting that the 51st Highland Division gains this reputation. They perform superbly at the battles of High Wood and Beaumont-Hamel. By 1917, they are widely recognized, along with the Australian divisions and the Canadian divisions. It's the 51st Highland Division that is considered the elite of the British Army. They have major roles in both the battles of Arras and Cambrai. They're kind of the shock troops of the British Army by this point. Unfortunately, this level of commitment does mean significant casualties and very heavy casualties. And by 1918, the division is pretty well worn out, and they are hit hard during that last German offensive of the Western Front in March 1918, which is the Kaiserschlacht, the Kaiser's Battle. Which effectively it's a German attempt to break the British and French lines before sufficient numbers of American troops can arrive to turn the tide in the Allies' favor. And they do initially immensely well. The British and French lines do buckle. They almost break. The 51st Division is caught up in this. They hold just. And at that point, the morale of the German army collapses, and that's when you see the armistice in November 1918. So the 51st Highland Division has a storied history on the Western Front, but it is significantly hurt by those 3 to 4 years of fighting. But the 51st Highland Division is not the only Scottish contribution to the war. There are Scottish formations in every single British campaign of the war. And while there's only one Scottish division, the 51st Highland Division, there are Scottish regiments in every single British formation throughout the Western Front. And just to give you a sense of that, like the Royal Scots alone raise about 35 battalions during the war, 100,000 troops. There are Scottish troops on the Western Front. There are Scottish troops in Greece. There are Scottish troops at Gallipoli, the Royal Scots, the Cosbys, the King's Own Scottish Borderers, the Highland Light Infantry, they're all at Gallipoli. There's also a huge number of expat formations. So there are units of London Scottish made up of Scots living in London. There are Liverpool Scottish. There are Colonial Scottish, the Transvaal Scottish. There is the Canadian Black Watch that participates and does remarkably well during the horrors of Passchendaele in 1917. And just to give you a sense of maybe just one of these formations, I'll just mention McRae's battalion here. This is a PALS battalion. The PALS battalion were dreamt up by the Commander-in-Chief of the British Army, Lord Kitchener. And well, he's the Minister of War. He's not quite the Commander-in-Chief, sorry, that's my mistake. But he comes up with this idea in 1915. That in order to encourage enlistments, soldiers should be allowed to come forward with their friends and colleagues and enlist in the army without being split up and sent to different places. And the idea is that this will hugely increase kind of unit cohesiveness. So you have all these formations as part of what's called the New Army or the Kitchener Army that are based on workplaces or streets. So you'd have a PALS battalion that represented a certain district of, say, Glasgow, or you'd have a PALS battalion that represented, all the office workers in the Edinburgh Civil Service. One of those is called McRae's Battalion, and it's made up of basically the soccer team. You should call it football. I'm just saying. The soccer team Heart of Midlothian, which incidentally in 1914 is the best club in Scotland, and almost every single member of the Heart of Midlothian first line team joins the army, and they use this to encourage recruitment because, what's better than saying to a football fan, hey, you can fight alongside your footballing heroes. Now, the tragedy of the PALS battalions is, of course, you put a unit from one particular district or one particular workplace into combat and they lose a heavy percentage of their numbers, you suddenly find entire workplaces or entire streets or entire districts simply wiped off the map in terms of their young men. And that's the tragedy of the PALS battalions. And of course, the same thing happens to McRae's battalion. Some 35% of McRae's battalion is killed over the course of the war. Not 35% of the battalion, 35% of the original Heart of Midlothian soccer club. So about 1 in 3 of the first team of Hearts are killed over the course of the war. All of this is to say Scotland does make incredible contributions. But of course it comes at a cost. And I was really delighted to hear about the honor that you're bestowing on Professor Ferguson. This information here is from Professor Ferguson's immensely excellent work on the First World War called The Pity of War. And I would highly recommend it to anybody who's maybe a little interested in the First World War. It's a phenomenal book, but he really gives the sense here with these statistics just how brutal the war is for Scotland. If you compare it to kind of British and Irish averages under all metrics, as a percentage killed of those mobilized, as a percentage of all males between the ages of 15 and 49 killed, in terms of total killed as a percentage of population, Scotland is running somewhere about double the British and Irish average. Scotland's commitments are easily the equal of France, and even more astonishingly, the equal of many of the Central Powers. Probably the only the only nation that it doesn't even come anywhere close to is, of course, Serbia. And Serbia was absolutely obliterated by the First World War, by the initial Austrian and German attacks in 1914 and 1915. So all of this is to say, not only is Scotland's contribution noteworthy, it is statistically horrific. More Scots are killed per capita than anybody anywhere else in Britain, Ireland, or its colonies. And some of these things are really kind of illustrative, and I just want to highlight a couple of instances here. So below is the very famous case of the Illyra. The Illyra was a troop transport ship that was carrying men from Lewis in the Outer Hebrides back to their homes at the end of the war in 1919, when it struck a rock within sight of the shore, and somewhere around 200 men died, literally within sight of their homes. The monument on the right there is the Illyra Memorial. Illyra, basically the Gaelic name for eagle. That was the name of the ship. So some communities are utterly devastated. The other memorial there in the top right is Inkinesi, is the village where I grew up. In Kinusey and in the neighbouring village of Kincraig, there are some 95 names from the First World War on these two war memorials. Now, when you consider the fact that the entire population of the district was about 2,000 people in 1914, it really gives you a sense of just how brutal that is. If you want to do a kind of statistical analysis of that, it's about 5% of the total population of the district is killed in the war. And so, you know, that's even higher than the Scottish average, which is, as I just said, higher than the British and Irish average. So there are certain communities that are just utterly devastated by the war. So let's now, in the final kind of, I don't know, maybe 10, 12 minutes, I want to talk about some of the consequences. The first thing is to say, like, I would disagree with Weaver at the start because it's really not clear that Scotland was not changed by the war. And the first part of this is the anti-war movement. There had been no such thing really as an anti-war movement in any earlier British conflict. There had, of course, been war weariness. There had, of course, been resistance to recruitment or resistance to the economic consequences of conflict. There had never been an anti-war movement that was explicitly designed to say this war should simply not happen. And what's interesting here is that Scots actually are disproportionately involved in the British anti-war movement. There is something of an anti-war stance in Scotland. The day war is declared, some 5,000 people participated in an anti-war demonstration in Glasgow. And what this actually led to was open fights between people arriving at recruiting offices and the anti-war protesters. Now, in terms of numbers, 5,000 is not all that significant. And broadly, the anti-war movement in Britain is not significant overall. Most people, for the entire duration of the war, are in favor of the war's continuance because they know what it means. And this is one of the kind of strange things about the First World War. Often when we look back on it, we interpret it as a tragic waste. That is certainly not how the participants saw it, and it's certainly not how the people at the time saw it. People were deeply committed to the war, believed it to be a righteous war, and were overjoyed when it ended in the way it did. And famously, the British War Medal that's constructed after the war to kind of celebrate it describes the war as the Great War for Civilization, which is, of course, where you get the term the Great War. The civilization part kind of fell out of fashion for reasons of kind of empire and decolonization. But people believed that this was a valiant war. So I'm not saying that the anti-war movement is important. I am saying, however, that Scots are disproportionately involved. And there are Scots who object to certain aspects of the war as well. So famously, the Dora Act, or the Defence of the Realm Act, which is published in 1914, which kind of effectively suspends habeas corpus, tries to make sure that the home front is taken care of as Britain goes to war. There was widespread opposition in Scotland to this, and I hate to engage in stereotype here, but one of the reasons was because it shortened pub opening hours. And if there's one thing you definitely don't want to do to Scots, it's shorten their pub hours. There is also quite a lot of opposition to conscription. There are political campaigns that are led by the ILP, the Independent Labour Party, which is a socialist organization, and they created legal supports for conscientious objectors in Scotland. Ultimately, what this led to was very much reduced conscription in Scotland compared with England. In fact, Scotland only conscripts about 2/3 per capita of what England conscripts. And there's a few reasons for this, I think. First of all, so many Scots are volunteering that conscription is less necessary. But it's also the fact that there is this sense that the British government does not want to alienate Scots and does not want to and put Scots on the wrong side of the war. And so conscription is much less significant in Scotland than it is elsewhere. There's also a broader question to ask, like, why do you see this kind of anti-war movement in Scotland? Well, I think first and foremost, I think there is a rational calculation here. And again, to engage in another Scottish stereotype, you know, Scots are canny. We are very good at, assessing cost-benefit analysis. And I think there was a sense in Scotland as the war went on of, was the cost really worth the benefits? And this fits into what I was saying before, crucially, about the fact that the advantages of Scotland's connection with the British Empire are in decline by 1914, and I think there's a recognition of that. There is also a factor of poverty. It is obviously harder for poorer communities to justify the sacrifice that they're undergoing. And because Scotland is typically, on average per capita in 1914, poorer than England, that bit harder into the Scottish populace than it did in England. There is also, and we have to admit this, there is a relatively strong socialist undercurrent in Scotland by 1914. It is not predominant, it's not in the majority by any stretch of the imagination, but it is there. And it's because socialism tends to take hold in areas that are deprived, overcrowded, poverty-stricken, which are things that you could all apply to Scottish cities in the early 20th century. And then, of course, there are prominent Scots who are part of the anti-war coalition. So Keir Hardie is probably the most famous. He's the leader of the Labour Party, and the Labour Party is dead set against the war. Keir Hardie's actually arrested on the first day of the war for attempting to stage an anti-war demonstration. Then you have people like Robert Cunningham Graham, who's the first socialist elected to the British Parliament. He's a Scot. I will actually come back to him in a moment because he has another career which is equally interesting. Then you have the economic repercussions. Initially, at least, and of course, economic repercussions feed into this broader kind of anti-war thing. Initially, of course, there is a boom in Scotland thanks to the war. So obviously, shipbuilding, coal, steel, these are all things that increase broadly. Famously, the Parkhead Ordnance Works, which produced many of Britain's shells, they increased their production 7-fold over the course of the war. And then there's kind of micro economies. Shepherds, for example, do extremely well. Wages for shepherds in Scotland double. The war was actually quite good for the Scottish borders, at least economically. Because sheep mutton is being used to supply the forces, and therefore there's much more profit to be made in sheep farming than had been the case before the war. And part of the reason for this is that Britain had largely been importing its sheep in the period up to the war from colonies or dependencies, Australia and New Zealand, places like that, and that access is not cut off by the war, but it's severely decreased. So Scottish shepherds do very well out of the war. But again, over the course of the war, there are disadvantages. Fishing, for example, collapses. The North Sea becomes a war zone, and there are, of course, German U-boats operating. So fishing becomes extremely difficult. Overseas trade is restricted. So jobs that depended on overseas colonial contacts, they decline. And then, of course, as is typical to every war, there are increased housing, fuel, and food costs that really bite into these poor communities very quite hard. The British government, however, is somewhat reactive to the Scottish situation. So there are a number of social and economic protests throughout the war in Scotland, and in each case, the British government does react. And the British government is very scared about, because it depends so much upon Scottish manpower, it is very scared about alienating Scotland. So some of the first strikes during the war, beginning in Glasgow, some of the first British strikes of the war begin in Glasgow. There's an engineer strike in 1915 when 10,000 engineers went on strike. And the British government immediately reacts by raising wages. They also say that, hey, strikes are now illegal. You can't do it anymore. But they are obviously demonstrating that they're worried about this. There are also rent strikes, efforts to kick tenants out and evict tenants are met with opposition and violence in Glasgow. So, rents are going up. And when people couldn't pay the rents, eviction notices would be issued. But then the community would gather around and literally just stand outside the house and say, hey, like, come on, sheriff and the police, you want to evict this family, you have to go through us first. And the British government reacts to this as well. They put in a Rent Restriction Act. They put artificial restrictions on how much landlords can charge for rent. There is most famously the so-called Battle of George Square in 1919, which involves many soldiers returning from the front. There's a kind of 100,000 people demonstrate in favor of a shorter working week. And given the context of what had just happened in Russia and what is happening around that same time, a failed effort, but say the Spartacist uprising in Berlin in 1918, led by Rosa Luxemburg. There are communist revolutions occurring in Bavaria, in Berlin, obviously in Russia. The British government is deeply concerned that Glasgow might succumb to a communist revolution. It's probably not accurate to say it would have. But nevertheless, the British government deploys 12,000 troops and tanks and artillery into the streets of Glasgow to prevent this. But they also cut the working week by about 7 hours. So the demonstrators actually get one of their main concerns, although the repressive part of it is well and truly there. And then in the Highlands, there are increasing land raids during the war. One of the kind of classic tactics of Highlanders in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was to squat on land, to raid land and basically just set up shop. They claimed, hey, like, we don't own this land, but we haven't got enough land. So what they would do is they would just walk over to land that a landowner owns and just start grazing their cattle or grazing their sheep on it. These land raids quadrupled during the war because things are becoming harder because of wartime conditions. And the government again responds to this. And this is probably one of the most significant changes to happen as a result of the First World War. It doesn't affect a lot of people because obviously there are not very many people in the Highlands and Islands, but in terms of just what it means, it is hugely significant. The Land Settlement Act of 1919 involves compulsory government purchase of lands from landowners to be redistributed to the tenantry. Now, if you think about this, this is astonishing. So at the same time that the British government is putting troops and tanks into Glasgow because they're scared about a communist revolution, the government is also forcibly purchasing land from landowners in the Highlands and Islands and redistributing it to tenants in order to try and alleviate the demand for land in the Highlands. And I mean, obviously, as a Highlander, I'm, fully supportive of the Land Settlement Act. But it is just remarkable just what the wartime conditions had led the British government to think and conceive of. I mean, this is probably one of the most socially progressive things done by a British government, arguably in its history. And it occurs directly because of a response to Highland land rage during the war. And then one final thing. Oh, no, actually, sorry, yeah, I just want to show you a couple of pictures from some of these rent strikes and during the war. So on the right, on the left there, sorry, there's one of the pamphlets from the Battle of George Square. I love the little image in the right hand corner. No surrender. God help the sheriff officer who enters here. These are the people who are, defending people from eviction. So, come on, sheriff officer, do your worst. Also noteworthy in the top right-hand picture is the little boy in the front holding a sign that's saying, "My father is fighting in France. We are fighting," and I can't quite read that, and if anybody can, I'm really impressed. But, basically drawing the conclusion, hey, we are doing our part for the war. Now the government needs to do its part and prevent us from being evicted from our homes. There, just to prove it, there's tanks in the Trongate in Glasgow. Tanks moving into Glasgow. It's a kind of bizarre scene. You've got the trolleys in the background there, and then troops in armor moving through the streets. One final thing, because I've gone maybe 3 or 4 minutes over what I wanted to do, but I want to finish with just one thing, and that is the political repercussions. And there again, there's the communist banner, the red flag being flown in Glasgow in 1919. There are political consequences of the war as well. Socialism is one of them. Famously, Scotland, in particular Glasgow, becomes associated with socialism. It is not the majority political idea in Scotland by any stretch of the imagination. Socialists and communists remain in the minority. But it would be silly to pretend that socialism does not become an active part of the Scottish political scene. And in part, it's because, obviously Scotland did have these relatively poor, overcrowded urban areas prior to the war. But it also the war demonstrates that people power, people working together can actually achieve goals vis-a-vis government and government policy. And this leads to certain areas of Glasgow becoming known as Red Clydeside for their kind of socialist leanings. The majority political party in Scotland before the war were the Liberals. They were a kind of centrist party, and they are utterly wiped out by the war. For the large part, the Liberals lead the war, but their mishandling of the war leads to their collapse. And what happens is on the left, their position is taken by Labour, and on the right, their position is taken by Conservatives. And both Labour and Conservatives will draw heavily on Scottish voters in the interwar period. So you have Scottish leaders of the Labour Party who become Prime Minister in the interwar period. You also have conservative leaders, Scottish conservative leaders who become prime ministers in the interwar period, predominantly Andrew Bonar Law. You also have, and this is interesting, the rise of nationalism. Now, just how much connected into the war this is somewhat questionable, but there is no doubt that the Scots returning home from the war do see, in a sense, in the same way that many Canadians and Australians did, that their contributions to the war should be recognized in some way, shape, or form as justifying a certain national perspective. And so the Scottish National Party is formed in 1934, but it's formed from several nationalist-leaning parties that are established immediately following the First World War. And what's interesting about this is Robert Cunningham Graham, the socialist, the first socialist elected to the British Parliament that I mentioned earlier on, he actually becomes the first leader of the Scottish National Party. And what nationalists start to do is, and is what they have done relatively successfully throughout the remainder of the 20th century, is to draw nationalist interest and political interest from both the right and left, depending on circumstance, to build a broad nationalist coalition that eventually came together in 2014 and just didn't quite get over the line. So that is me out of time. I want to just come back very briefly to Weaver and his idea that, you know, Scotland was somehow different to England and to an extent had not been changed by the war. I hope I've given you some food for thought. I hope I've given you kind of a sense of he may be right some ways. There are places where he is definitely not. I'm sorry I went over. Thank you so much for your time. I so much appreciate it. And I'm absolutely delighted to hear any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Bravo, bravo, bravo. Thank you, Professor Dziennik. We do have some questions in the chat, but I would like to also invite those from the floor to engage with Professor Dziennik.
Yeah, so what I'll do is I'll just run through a couple of these first. So yeah, from Bonnie, yes, no. So the locations, I am not up on the locations, I'm afraid. If I can take your email, I'll get back to you on the exact locations. But yes, there are German prisoners of war stationed in Scotland, and as with quite often happens with prisoners of war, the locals and prisoners of war find that they have an awful lot more in common than they necessarily have against each other. And there's quite a lot of community back and forth between the prisoners and the local population. So if I get your email, Bonnie, I'll track down the locations for you and I'll let you know. How many pipers, Mr. Chapman? I'm so sorry. I don't know. There are, of course, very famous instances of pipers being awarded medals of even the Victoria Cross for getting up on the parapet and playing the pipes. And of course, Highland regiments went in playing the pipes. And it's not just for the Scots that the pipes are being played. To be perfectly honest, it's also been played for the Germans. Because it's all about, kind of how can you impose your will on the enemy. And if the Germans knew there were Scots opposite them, that, like those Germans are maybe a little less willing to stay in their trenches that little bit longer. But I don't know the figures. Again, if I take your email, I will try and track down an answer for that. One thing I very quickly would say, and I hate to say this, but so one of the reputedly Scots were known as the ladies from hell because of their kilts during the First World War. Nobody has yet to come up with the actual German original documentary evidence for that. So I'm not saying it's not true, but we certainly don't have the written evidence that Germans ever called Scots the ladies from hell. We do know from German letters that Germans were scared of facing predominantly Scots, Canadians, and Australians. So, Scots have this elite reputation, but ladies from hell, we're not quite sure. Where am I? Yes. Okay. Right. Data on the number of Americans who were of Scottish descent. Again, I'm so terrible. I'm sorry. I don't have that to heart, to mind. I would imagine that it might be slightly tricky to identify. From the point of view of the American military was not particularly concerned with the ethnic origin of its enlistees during the war. Partly this is because about a third of Americans in 1914 are either first or second generation from the Central Powers. And so there is this concern that if you start asking too many questions about ethnic origin, you may find that you're enlisting far too many Germans to go and fight the Germans. But it's also because this is a moment in American history where hyphenated identities are becoming somewhat worrisome to certain sections of the American elite. So Teddy Roosevelt famously saying, you know, in the early 20th century, hey, there's no such thing as Irish American or Polish American. We are all just American. And, you know, like, you don't need to agree with that. And I don't agree with that. But it was necessarily the case, therefore, that the US Army is not really keeping data on that. So it might be a hard thing to identify. What you could probably identify, and I will try and do this for you, Connie, if I may, is see how many of the American troops are Scottish born and compare that with how many are English born or German born, and that might give you some sort of, you know, way to find that.
Side
You're
anecdote on
fighting for
that.
the mums at home. That's what it will be, Catherine. That's wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, that's great. Your eyesight's much better than mine. And I'm sorry, I interrupted something.
Yeah, I was going to say side anecdote on Scots fighting in the American Army. My grandfather emigrated in 1913, just before the war, because he saw no future in Scotland. He'd been a member of the territorial regiment of the King's Own Scottish Borderers. So he got a letter immediately when the war started saying, come back and defend Mother England. And his mother sent him a letter saying, stay there. I want one son alive at the end of this thing. Wow. Then she got serious and just said, you know, you chose to go to America, be a good American. So what did he do? When the Americans got in the war, enlisted in the American Army, ended up because he had some military training as a first sergeant. Yeah. And got retained twice to train troops, and then finally got over to France just as the war was ending.
Just as the war was ending. And I would imagine that was extremely common. I would imagine that, you know, given America's also kind of resistance to standing armies traditionally, that I think many territorial and conscripts with military experience from Europe would have been put into certain leadership positions within the American military. There is one case, and I don't want to drone on because I want to hear your questions, but there is one interesting case I just wanted to highlight, and it's just because the guy was from Kinusy, where I'm from. There was a guy born in Minnesota. His family had emigrated from Kinusy to Minnesota. He was born in Minnesota, but then the family came back to Kinusy prior to the war. And he ends up fighting and being killed in Arras in 1917. And I just find that a really kind of fascinating story because, you know, typically when we talk of immigrant stories, we talk of people who come and stay. But there is also these immigrant stories of people who come and then sometimes they leave again, or sometimes they go somewhere else. And that, you know, that's also just from our, you know, we live in an increasingly globalized and moving world. That's maybe something that we should, you know, think about. Anyway, sorry. Yeah, questions.
Yeah, quick question. How badly was the Scottish Army affected by the Black Plague that was going on back then? Because I know I had an ancestor who joined the army in the U.S. and was sent over, and he died on the way over. He got off the ship.
Yeah, so the Spanish influenza. Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's I haven't looked at the statistics exactly on regimental breakdowns, but you are highly likely to find it being as damaging to Scottish regiments
Yeah.
as any other regiments. Um, the I mean, of course, the tragedy of Spanish influenza is it's the civilian populations that suffer the most
Mhm.
because say what you want, the soldiers were actually relatively well fed. It's one of the kind of strange things. Many Scots who end up joining the army, it was the best food they'd ever had in their life because they'd grown up in poverty and suddenly they're getting British Army rations that are meant to, get 3,000 calories into them a day. And that's just, it's a change. And unfortunately for the civilian population, they're still eating, hand to mouth. And particularly for the German population, they had been starved by the war. Influenza hits them tremendously badly because they don't have the immunity or the calorific intake to resist it.
On your central thesis about whether Scotland was transformed by the war, I think you have to consider what happened after the war in terms of emigration. And so there was kind of a boost of the economy right in 1919, and then massive out-migration in the 1920s. And they actually more Scots came to America in 1923 than at any year in history, right? And so obviously that transformed the homeland just to lose so many people. And obviously too, there was the long-term economic decline that really predated the Depression here by many years. And actually by the 1930s, when the US was in depression, most Scots were going home from here, and there was a reverse migration. So I wholeheartedly agree with your perception that this was a different country that emerged from that war than before. And obviously there was always big out migration before the war, but it was just phenomenal what happened in the 20s. And
Absolutely. Yeah, sir. Thank you so much for that. I did not mention that, and I really should have because you're 100% spot on. It's both in Scotland and Ireland, we often think of these, in the kind of traditional stereotype, we think of migrants and we think of, Highlanders in the 18th century and things like that. But yes, the 1920s are the moment of greatest out migration. And it's to the US, it's to Canada, it's to the colonies. My grandmother's get this right, my grandmother's parents emigrated to New Zealand in the 1920s. And that, that's absolutely true. Absolutely true. I am curious if anybody had any kind of thoughts on, or like Mr. Cameron there, to add to the kind of transformation of Scotland, or whether you maybe think it was not as transformative as might have been the case.
Well, your point about reverse migration, people coming back and forth. I mean, my family story is, my grandfathers and my grandmother both came here in 23. And then following year, my great grandparents came here, and then they went back and they went back to Glasgow, try to make, survive. And by the end of the 20s, they decided to come back to the US. And unfortunately for them, they got here just as the Depression hit here. So after several years of trying to survive in Chicago, they were back in Scotland. But the level of their so they were, this is Scotland had always been kind of one of the reasons for out migration was that it was always a low wage economy relative to US obviously, but even to England. And I think that that, as you said, fueled the growth of the socialist movement, but also just in general, this kind of the Scotland of the 20s and 30s, remember as kind of a dingy, dark time, and not at all comparable to the country this year or in this century. So I certainly think it was, transformative.
Couldn't agree more.
Professor, we have another comment from Melanie and Alan. The impact of the war on agriculture and the coming of mechanized equipment, the decline in horsepower, labor, and in traditional farm towns.
Yeah. So that is a great point. When I was growing up, I grew up in Kinesi, and Kinesi was home to the Highland Folk Museum. The Highland Folk Museum, I don't know if anybody's ever had the pleasure to visit the Taitashka Gaeltach, is just this amazing open air museum that charts the history of folk life in the Highlands over the past 300 years. And one of the locations they have is a 1930s farm. And so this is a subject that I know relatively well, because what of course happened was you started to see the introduction of tractors, mechanized harvesters. You have Ford tractors, McCormick tractors coming in. There's this wonderful shift where you've got Highlanders using American made mechanical contraptions. And very similar to Mr. Cameron's point, like the 20s and the 30s are in this sense, this transformative moment. Of course, the Gaelic-speaking Scotland had suffered numerous oppressions throughout the 19th century, but it's really in the 20th century that the cohesiveness of many communities just disintegrates. And the reason for that are a few things, but one of them is the introduction of mechanization, and mechanization small enough that it can actually be used on Highland and Island farms. And once you introduce that, there is far less need to keep people in the villages. And with the increase in transportation and the effectiveness of transportation, the opportunity for those people to go to the cities to live and work there is just too great. And that's, and please don't interpret this as kind of trying to downplay the horror of the Highland clearances. But in terms of actual depopulation of the Highlands, the introduction of mechanization and mass transit is probably more important than the role of landlords and clearance in purely numerical terms. Now that doesn't cover the injustice and the immorality of it, but in pure numbers, it does. So yeah, Melanie and Alan, that's a really great point. And I would highly recommend, if you can get to the Highland Folk Museum, please do. It's such a wonderful place.
Other questions or comments for Professor Dziennik?
Hello. Yeah, this is Bill McLeod. I was traveling to the Isle of Raasay, and there was an abandoned coal mine there. And I was told during World War I it was used, the German prisoners were actually the workers in that coal mine. And I don't know if that was a common thing, that they used prisoner of war labor to keep things going in the mines.
Yes, absolutely. So this is I'd be really interested to know about the specific mine, and of course it relates to Bonnie's question. But yeah, so the Germans are largely used for agricultural labor. I'd not heard of them being used in mines. The theory is that agricultural labor, you can spread them out. So you can spread prisoners of war out. The problem with mining is that you're effectively getting people together. And when you can get people together with a little more free range than in a prisoner of war camp, there's always the potential for something to go wrong. And so the preference was to put them into agricultural work because they'd be spread out. Also, agricultural work, it's less subject to deliberate work slowdowns or sabotage than necessarily industry and coal mining. So I'd not heard of that, but I will try. I'll try and track that down because that would be really interesting. Is it on the road out to Rassay? You know, before you get to the ferry?
No, it's actually on Rassay.
Oh, right. Okay.
Right on Rassay, yeah.
Well, what I'll do is I'll have a look at that and I'll let Connie know and she can maybe pass that along to you, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Happy to, happy to. I think if there's anything else, we'll ask you to pipe up soon. There's one more comment from Melanie and Alan. My friend's great-great-grandfather was a porter in Newton Moore Station. His son, Ian McPherson, was Secretary of State for War, and another son, a member of the Indian Civil Service, remarkable social mobility education in Scotland at the time.
That is, yes, that is amazing. That is fantastic. I'd love to know more. I'm gonna try and okay, right. I'm gonna look more into that. So I'm gonna take a wee note of that.
Yes, and I'm gonna I'll put my email address on the chat right now for anyone who wants to stay and copy it down. And I'm happy to get messages to Professor Dziennik. So I'll do that right now. Okay, so you should have my email address. But I think, Matthew, we may need to wrap it up today. It has been enormously interesting. And Dr. Dziennik has promised to return. So you'll be seeing him again in a few months with another interesting subject. And we just delight in hearing from your scholastic pursuits, Doctor. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much to everybody. And I've just put my email in the chat there. So if any questions come up later, just feel free to reach out to me.
Oh, good. Yes. MDZINNI
Yeah.
at usna.edu.
Yeah, I know. Not only a Polish name, but a difficult one at that.
Immigrants to Scotland, if I don't
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Thanks to everybody. This forum is so important, and we just can't thank you enough for joining every month and supporting all of these scholars and Scottish academics worldwide and historians, and your contributions have been enormous. And thank you. Be safe and see you next month.
Thank you, Constant.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thanks. Great to see everyone. Bye.
I'll be in touch, Matt.
Yeah, no problem, Connie. And as I said before, let me know what I can do to help.
Okay, will do. You
Right.
will.
I want to hear more about the what you're dealing with.
Working on. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay.
Okay.